everyone. I'm so excited to be here. Today what I'm going to be talking about is that art is an indispensable tool in building social change. And I'm going to walk you through some of my own experiences growing up. Also that art and culture precedes politics. You know, I think often we think about these political moments in our lives, like the election of Barack Obama or marriage equity, as these moments, very historical moments in time. And we forget the years and years it took to come to that cultural moment where cultural consciousness was shift. How many of you remember '97 when Ellen DeGeneres was on television for the first time, the first openly gay woman? So that was over 15 years ago. And I want to remind you that back then we were in an era where people were not coming out, right? You had don't ask, don't tell. You couldn't talk about whether you were queer in the military. And here we are 15 years later. We have Rachel Maddow. We have sports figures coming out on the cover of Sports Illustrated. And how did this cultural shift happen? Well, it happened because people were working in the space of ideas. I think that often when we think about social change, we think about laws, right? We think about these things, what the people in Congress do and how they shape our lives. And yes, laws are critical, but laws follow culture. Culture precedes politics. And this is why, first, we have to change culture. And that's what I'm going to be talking about today. Thank you. So I was born in Oakland, California, and my family, my father is an Afro-Peruvian migrant. He's from Peru, and my mother is also Peruvian, and they came here when they were 19 and 20, and they worked hard, 2 jobs, and they had my brother and I. When I was growing up, I remember that my parents were often very like, you know what, just kind of keep a low profile. We're migrants, we don't really belong. And I remember going to school and always feeling like not included, right? I remember that the food I ate, the way that my hair looked, I was just not represented in the textbooks. I was pretty invisible. I was definitely not represented in advertisements, in television, in film. I mean, how many of you can name me one film with a Latina protagonist in the last 5 years, right? You know that Latinos are the fastest growing population. In California, we are now the majority, and yet we're invisible. And this is the problem. This is actually what racism does, is that it creates an invisible people so that everyone here actually has no idea often what Latino families are like, because we don't have these complex, multi-dimensional stories. So growing up in a migrant family, I remember very clearly when I was 16, 1994, Bill Clinton passed what? What law did he pass in '94 that changed forever the course of the global economic picture? NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Agreement. Now NAFTA, of course, was this promise of free trade, right? Free trade without borders. That suddenly transnational corporations would not have borders. Everything would be open. Well, how about this? When you have companies moving freely across borders, what do you think workers are going to do? Right? And you know that the same year that NAFTA passed was the same year that they began to build a wall at the US-Mexico border. They began to militarize the border. And so I realized, you know what, when we say that borders are open, it's actually only for the elites. It's only for the people with big money. And you know what ended up happening, we all now know the effects of NAFTA, which is that we had many jobs from the United States leave. In fact, you can trace some of the effects of what happened in the recession to irresponsible corporations. And so during that time, I was in high school, and I remember seeing people like seeing people like Lou Dobbs and Pete Wilson, who used to be the governor of California, say things like, illegal this, the illegals are coming for your jobs. I mean, here we are 15 years later, and you still have that rhetoric. That rhetoric dominates American politics. The word illegal was actually very carefully crafted by a white supremacist network. They're called the John Tanton Network. And they knew that if they got Americans to understand migrants as the other, that they would be winning the cultural war, which would then lead to some of the worst anti-immigrant laws we have ever seen. Okay, so today, you know, people say, well, why don't they just get legalized, right? Why don't these migrants just get legalized? It takes 25 years to get your visa to be here. If you are an American, if you're a migrant mother and you have American kids, do you think you can get your papers like that? No, you can't. In fact, a quarter of the people who are deported are parents of US citizen children. And every single day we see 1,000 deportations. And so this was a reality for me in my community From 94 through 2010, remember what happened in 2010 in Arizona, SB 1070, one of the worst anti-immigrant bills. And if you trace how we got into a situation where today the Obama administration is deporting 1,000 migrants and is incarcerating mothers and their children in prisons in Texas, we can begin to understand that it's because we are looking at migrants through a criminality lens, right? We're looking at them as lawbreakers, as not belonging. We forget that NAFTA displaced 2 million farmers. We killed their corn industry with our GMO corn. And so as an artist, I began to think to myself, you know what, I'm not really interested in just being the person who's against. While I know that there's very oppressive laws happening to many in our community, many people you love, I'm sure many of you have family members who are migrants, but that it should not just be about fighting for laws. There's another war that's happening in the imagination, which is an unconscious bias. When people think Mexicans, they think illegals, right? So how do we shift that? And so I began a project called Migration is Beautiful, which was using the symbol of the monarch butterfly, which is this one. Using the symbol of the monarch butterfly is the longest migrating insect in the world. The monarch flies from Mexico through the US, Canada, and back. If the monarch does not fly, the monarch will die. The monarch is actually now in threat because of climate change, right? But the monarch freely crosses borders. And when you have sites in New Mexico and in Texas where people are anxiously awaiting the monarchs. In fact, President Obama has created a corridor for the butterflies to cross. Now imagine if we were to imagine migrants as monarchs. You know, how many of you go to restaurants, you just have to look in the back and look who's cooking for you, look who's picking your food. And you know what? Migrants are holding up the US economy. So how about we show some gratitude? You know, thank you. Thank you. Imagine if at the border, we built a monument to the migrant. We really celebrated the heroism that it takes for women. You know that the majority of migrants are women, you know, and you know when they cross the US-Mexico border from Central America, 80% of them are raped. 80% of women crossing into the US are raped. And despite this, they continue because the desire to survive, the human will, is greater than anything else. And what would it take for one of you to get on top of a train in El Salvador and ride for 50, 100 miles on top of a train because you were just so hungry to survive, because you knew back home you would die? That is a heroic act. And I think that we have to shift the way we think. This is why I believe art and culture is powerful, because art and culture can change our unconscious and it can help us see differently. It's not just about changing a law. I'm a social justice advocate, but I think laws, you know what it's going to take to convince those old white guys in Congress to think like us? It's going to take years. Those guys are, many of those people, mostly men in Congress who are making laws about your birth control and your right to abortion, if we try to talk to them, their frame of change is like this. And I know that all of our frame of change is like this. And this is why we don't just have to think about action, right? It's not just about marching. It's not just about sitting, doing an occupation, or calling your representative. That's important, but idea shifting is critical. And the second thing I want to move into next is why art? Why is culture so important? Because art and culture is about systemic change. It's entirely discarding a system. I'll share a story with you. You know, I grew up in a family where education was the #1 thing. I mean, I had to go to engineering camp in the summer. I had a 4.2 GPA. I got full ride to Cal. I was, you know, in after-school math tutorial. It was all about, you know, getting that honors status, because that's what would make my family proud. My parents didn't go to college. They came here in order to have a better life for us. And it was all about school, because you know what? They didn't have a trust fund. They definitely were not bringing wealth from their home country. And so their way of building wealth was through their children. And as I was growing up, you know, I was like one of those all-star teens who won all the, you know, on the honor roll and won all the competitions and was always on TV representing the model minority Latina, right? And when I went to college when I was 18, I went to Cal. And I realized that, well, first, it was the first time that I was able to connect, you know, with guys and be, because my parents, not only were they very strict, they were always like, close your legs. If you're gonna go out, you're gonna go out with your cousins. It was a very negative sex culture. In my family, they were very Catholic, and of course the Catholic Church was all about virginity. I mean, I don't know if you've all gone to a quinceañera or gone to a wedding. You know, the symbol of whiteness is a symbol of virginity. It's a purity. And of course, those ideas were indoctrinated into me. And when I got to college and I was finally free, 2 years into college, I got pregnant. And when I told my partner at the time, he was out, disappeared, and I ended up having to have an abortion by myself almost about 9 weeks into my pregnancy. And I kept that secret for many, many years. I kept it secret. This was 2000. And I kept it secret until 2012. Because in 2012, you had the onslaught, the worst onslaught of anti-choice legislation to happen since Roe versus Wade. Roe versus Wade is the law that gave us the right to have an abortion. And in 2012, next thing you know, 500 anti-abortion measures, 500. By 2013, it was 1,000, okay? And there was a woman who I met, Tammy Baldwin, a senator, who came out and said, I had an abortion and I'm not afraid to say it. So let's think for a moment, because I know there's women in here who've had an abortion. You know that 1 in 3 women in this country will have an abortion before they're 40? 1 in 3. And yet, the shame and stigma is so bad that we are silent about it. And this is what I mean by culture. Culture has created a sense of stigma and shame that keeps women in the closet. And it's the same stigma and stain that Harvey Milk spoke out against. When he said, come out of the closet, Harvey Milk was saying, shed your stigma, because when you connect with your story to another human being, we will win. And this is why, as someone who's had an abortion, I'm out about it, because I believe that we can change the culture around shame and stigma. And then as I began to see, you know what, wow, you know, here we are fighting for our right to keep abortion legal, but we're also fighting for our damn birth control. Do you see how they're trying to take away our birth control? Okay, and so I wanted to go back to the space of ideas. Art and culture is the space of ideas. So what is the core idea here? The core idea that is preventing us from getting our full women reproductive health, which includes birth control and includes abortion. It's because there's an idea in the United States that women's sexuality is dangerous. And you know that just by the sex ed you receive. In the sex ed that you learn about, many of you probably learned about the vagina, right? What the hole where things go in and out, or a baby comes in and out. Did you learn about the clitoris when you were in high school? How many of you learned about female pleasure in high school? Okay, this is the state of sex education in one of the most advanced nations in the world. And you wonder why we have a rape crisis at the university, 1 in 5 young women getting sexually assaulted? Because we have a culture of sex is silence. We are silent about sex. How are people supposed to learn to have great sex? How are people supposed to learn about the clitoris, which has 8,000 nerve endings, twice as many as a penis? And our clitoris is removed, is separate from our reproductive organ. Okay, so women, it's not just about us reproducing, it is about pleasure. That's why when we're saying we're saying no, we're using birth control, we don't want to have babies, and yes, we want to have sex, we want to have a lot of sex, and we want to be safe. And so I'm going to close it out with an idea that you can take with you, which is the idea of pussy power. And the idea about pussy power is that it is time for a pussy power revolution, because you know what? The men in leadership, in global leadership, have created the largest wealth gap ever in the history of the world, have created a moment where our planet is dying, have created a system where students are facing debt in the most richest country in the world. And I believe that women's leadership, that when we fully embody our power, which includes our pussies and our full sexual liberation to be free and to express ourselves and to enjoy our bodies in the way that we were designed to, that's going to completely change the world. So with that, remember, art is indispensable, and thank you so much.